This is Articulate with Jim Cotter.
Let's start off big. I remember a few years ago, Infiniti had this really interesting commercial where they said something like, it's not how a car looks or even how it drives, it's how it makes you feel. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Somebody finally got it. And as I've been thinking about, as we've been doing this feature, I've been thinking about the idea that that really is the thing, because the conventional wisdom was that what the cars we bought were sort of social statements, that we were telling the world who we were. But the more I think about it, I think it's just more of an affirmation of who we think we are ourselves. Why have we got this crazy, messed up emotional relationship with a collection of metal and rubber and oil?
Don't you think that that's kind of true of any of our possessions, right? Like, I think that your house or people have this about their barbecue grill in their backyard. They got the better one than their neighbor, Anything.
Right.
And a car, of course, is a big purchase. And you're in it all the time. You're commuting in it. You're sitting in it. People see it in front of your house, in your driveway, whatever. And so it's a big way to show people, who you think you are. That's an excellent way to sum it up. It's a representation of who you think you are, maybe not necessarily what you actually are.
Right, and there's so many different statements we can make, social, economic, political even. I drive a Prius, therefore I'm an environmentalist. I drive a Cadillac, I probably vote Republican, because I'm a patriot and I have money. Or I drive a big SUV. I drive a Subaru Outback. I'm an outdoors person, right. And et cetera, et cetera. I have a nice 5 Series BMW. I'm a pretty successful mid-level executive. Do you think that is still the case, that those are the statements we're making with that? Does everybody read cars, do you think?
I don't think everybody reads many cars, but I think people who are intentionally trying to specifically make a statement with their car, if someone shows up in a Prius, if someone shows up in a Camry, they just have a car. My test is always, would my wife notice it? That's my test. She doesn't care about cars. If someone pulled up in a lifted pickup truck, she would notice that and make some assumptions. If someone pulled up in a minivan, okay, maybe you have kids. That's as far as the thought process goes. But I think that there's still a lot of that tied to the car that you have. And maybe not everybody reads cars, but certainly some people do, many people do. And so for people who buy or lease cars, that's something that they want. They're trying to broadcast that to, even if not everybody does, to the people who are.
Right. There used to be a joke in England years ago, because with the British cars, they have the GT4, LE, XLE, and they have all these letters after stuff. And the joke used to be that the only people who understood what those meant were suburban housewives, because they were playing the one-upmanship game, they've got the XLE, we have to get the XLX.
Right, and there is that. I'm sure that happens in your area. It happens everywhere. Everybody, and, I get a new car, and the first thing that happens, my neighbors, oh, hey, well, you got one of those, huh? I was like, wow, okay. That's how it is.
Is it fair to say everybody makes pretty good cars now? And my sense is that because of that, and we're getting near the end of the speed race, the performance race. The speed thing is the 0 to 60, it's kind of over at this point.
Right.
The handling thing, well, you can either drive a car that you have to drive, or, a computer will take care of your handling for you. So the actual sort of race car experience, I think that's diminishing. And the reliability piece seems to kind of be taken care of almost by everybody. The safety thing, again, most cars are pretty safe compared to even 10 years ago. And my sense now is that we're back into a situation where it is the design. And this was the name of this piece is Jets and Sharks, sort of a reference to West Side Story, but it's to do with the fact that we had all these jet designs and we had these space age designs, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s.
Right.
But if you look at, you mentioned the Camry, you look at the new Camry, you look at the Honda Civic, there's a lot of cars out there, most of the Lexuses, and they've got very sharp, angular faces.
Right.
They're quite aggressive looking. And I'm just wondering, is that a first attempt by the designers, since there's no other reason for you to buy a new car, that they're now building in design obsolescence, that they want to make these radical statements which will look terrible in 6 years?
I don't necessarily think specifically that's the goal, but there's no question that cars are bolder in their look now, and in an intentional way. They're not bolder because, like, in the 60s, cars were beautiful, right? They had these flowing lines, and it was. Now there are a lot of cars I get into have fake stuff, fake vents and fake aerodynamic, and I think there is a component of that for sure. But I have to say, with all of these aggressive and sharp angles, I'm kind of into it. I kind of like the fact that I think there was a period maybe in the last few years that cars started to look very similar. And I think automakers took a lot of that criticism to heart. And I think it's not necessarily planned obsolescence as much as, to me, there's a component of they're trying to be more distinctive. They got the message that cars, because of regulations, cars had started to look all very similar. And now it's like, well, how can we push the envelope and still conform? And I think that, yeah, the Camry, the Civic are good examples. We have to make it this long, this big, whatever. What can we do to stand out from the competition? Will they look bad in 5-8 years? Yeah, maybe. But if people are buying them now because the new Civic looks more interesting than a new Hyundai, then it was a success.
There was that. I mean, there was a period I felt like basically from 2000 on where and maybe this is just my European eyes, that American cars started to look better. Maybe they just started to look more European. I don't know. But you're right. I don't know if you ever saw that photo where they put a BMW grille, I think, on a Genesis or something, and they said this is the new M8, or sorry, the new M7. And you looked at it and you went, yeah, that's a BMW.
Yeah.
And so that was, you think that was the point where everybody went, come on, you all look alike. And you couldn't find your car in a parking lot if you owned
Well, don't you
any
think,
car.
I mean, there was that period, and even for some automakers, I think it's still going on to an extent. But I think that more and more cars are starting to get more and more distinctive. People were complaining, and things have changed. And we are now getting cars that, for better or worse, certainly look. I mean, Lexus is the best example, right? Lexus made blobbish type cars for old people for a long time. Well, not anymore. In fact, my dad had Lexuses, and he's scared of it now. It's not going to go down that road. Because it's too bold. But that's I think that's the point. And I'm into it. I really think that's a better way to do it. It helps people come to the conclusion that, hey, maybe, here's something more fun or more interesting.
There was a time when motor racing was the starting point, and that's where we got the performance, and that's where we got the safety as well in latter years.
Right.
And that's not really the case anymore. Now it's the Audi, the R8, or it's the Lexus. So
yeah, the LC and the LFA.
Yeah, the LFA. Is that where is there now a sort of a trickle down from car companies saying we're going to make something really radical, no expense spared, it's going to be great, and that will teach us how to reorient ourselves, both from a design point of view and from all the other point of views? Or is motor racing still relevant?
No, motor racing, especially in terms of design and safety, has become so much less relevant, which is a shame. But motor racing itself has had to deal with its own group of regulations that have totally changed the way those cars look and behave. And now there's such a small relevance between race cars and road cars. I mean, if you look at NASCAR or Le Mans racing in the 60s, those were the cars. You could drive those things to the track. And now it's just, there's not even a passing resemblance. With respect to the top-end cars then trickling down, that's certainly what the automakers want to happen. And the best example of this to me is actually the Porsche 918 Spyder. Porsche knew that they were going to have to start electrifying their cars. And it's a tough sell if you electrify the Cayenne and then tell people, hey, we're going to do this to the 911. Which is an icon. However, if you start with electrification in a car that costs $1 million and does 0 to 60 in 2.5 seconds, suddenly you do it on a 911 and it's cool. And there is that component. I think that is where a lot of automakers are trying to start. If we can get this stuff into the coolest car, the nicest car, the Lexus LFA is a great example. The styling, that was kind of where that styling cue originated. And then we trickle it down. Suddenly people want to buy an Audi A3 because the R8 has the same headlights, that kind of thing. That certainly is a component of it. Safety less so, though. I think safety features just get developed and introduced as quickly as possible. There's such a race in the car world now to get safety features together as soon as possible. And so that is more like, as soon as we can get it, let's put it out on the market and sell them, and we'll be the first to have that.
Right, because that is for a lot of people. That's the reason, right?
Yeah.
You know, give me. I don't know, what are they going to do next? Give me eyelash airbags, and I want that.
Right? Yeah. We're on that level. I mean, we're getting to that point. Some of these safety features are crazy. I always tell people the incremental increase in safety technology in the last 10 years is like the 40 years before it. I mean, it really feels like that. Adaptive cruise control, where it'll slow down and speed up for you, is now standard in the Toyota RAV4. 5 years ago, that was like you had to have a high-end BMW or Mercedes to get that.
Right. But it's also, is that in some way, well, I guess maybe if you're buying a RAV4, you're not buying it for the driving experience. Sorry, Toyota, no offense. But I mean, we are compromising the driving experience the more we allow the car to take care of the safety. And that's everything from, whatever the jiggery pokery that's stopping you from skidding, or, when you take that corner too fast and the car takes over. That is taking away from the driving experience. I mean, you can, to an extent, you can turn this stuff off, but they warn you about 15 times before you turn it off, right?
Yeah. No, there's no question about that. The more safety stuff you have, the less connected you feel. And generally that's true. But for most people, they're willing to make that trade-off. And I've also noticed that most of the sports cars have not been as quick to implement some of these safety features, or if they have, it's done in rather inobtrusive way. You can get a 911 with a lot of these things, but it still drives like a 911.
Let's do a little bit of chronology here, okay? And this is my take on it. Maybe you probably know more than I do about it. My sense of how the design of automobiles evolved was that sort of pre-World War II, you had motorized carriages for the wealthy and you had motorized carts for the middle classes. There was some ambition towards design in the more expensive cars and a little bit in the less expensive cars. To me, it all starts to happen, and unless we forget, Lancia and Alfa Romeo and Fiat and Ford, and they all existed from the early 1900s or even the late 1800s. So they'd been around. But to me, the idea of there being cars being really designed, really making a statement, and really having people use them to say who they are happens after the Second World War. Am I missing something?
No, that's generally true, with the exception of what you said, the wealthy. There were coach-built Bugattis and Rolls Royces that you see at Pebble Beach that were so beautiful and had all these fine details, like when you get in a beautiful old house. But yes, other than that, I mean, a lot of the cars from that era otherwise, to me, seeing them now are virtually indistinguishable, except for this very special one.
Right. So then there's a lot of theories about, okay, so first of all, we were all industrialized. We knew how to build things that worked because you didn't want a plane falling out of the sky in a dogfight. So, most of the world had become super industrialized for war production. Now they had to turn their hands to something else. And this was particularly true in Germany because they weren't allowed to have a military anymore.
Right.
And the old, the BMW propeller, which I think is a myth, but they like to hang on to it, that somehow they have their origins in making airplanes.
Right.
And the other factor that I've heard about, I don't know how true this is, that you have a lot of these guys who lived through the war and flew planes and drove tanks and interacted with these really great machines, and they come home and they want the adrenaline again. And to me, somebody suggested to me that this is the birth of the British sports car industry. And I mean, they even named one of their sports cars a Spitfire at one point.
Right.
That a lot of it is that these pilots came back, they wanted to get the adrenaline, and then people were seeing that the pilots drove these cool cars, and these were the heroes.
Right.
And now is there any truth in that, or did I just make that up?
That's a really interesting point. I've never really thought about that. But it makes some sense. And obviously combined with the industrialized aspect of it, because it was really right after World War II that in mass, especially these sports cars really started to develop from all of the countries. Because car production really kicked off, especially in Europe. I've always found it a very interesting thing that each European country had its own people's car. The Volkswagen Beetle, the 2CV was in France, the Fiat 500, and of course Britain had the Mini. And that was interesting to me, but that's car production really started to become a thing. Everybody started to get cars at that point. And so, yeah, then naturally it's, I want a faster car. And yeah, it makes sense.
Right, but even the people's cars, I mean, if you look at them now, they're iconic.
Totally.
The Beetle was, and I would say the Mini was later. I would say it was
Yeah.
the Morris Minor was probably the people's car.
Right.
And at the time, I thought they were awfully ugly, but I look at them now and I go, somebody thought about how that looks. Somebody didn't just throw that together.
Yeah.
You may not like it, ditto with the 2CV or the Fiat 500, but you almost feel like there was a human hand involved in the creation of it, and it wasn't just a collection of boxes with an engine. I feel like there's soul in those cars.
Right. Although one wonders if maybe we think that only with the perspective of today, where we look back and see, wow, those things were kind of charming. Because at the time, everybody had those cars. And they all uniformly complained about how slow they were and how unreliable they were, that sort of thing. But now we look back and say those cars mobilized those countries. Those cars changed the lives of the people who lived there, both from a production standpoint because they helped get the economies going again, and from a you could go somewhere point of view. Maybe it wouldn't have been comfortable cramming your German family into a Beetle, but it existed. Here was your opportunity to do something.
And then on this side of the pond in America, it's a much more. I mean, this is really sort of the birth of the American century in some ways, and that American, unrelenting optimism. It's the space age.
Yeah.
It's the Jetsons, and that's reflected in the car design in a way that it isn't in Europe. There isn't the optimism in car design in Europe that there is here. And that's when everybody was looking to America for optimism and for hope, and it's there on the road. And of course, you get the highway system being built as well. I mean, there were very national traits to cars. I mean, Europe, you say that all of those cars you mentioned look different, but you come across here, and American cars are really different.
Yeah.
Do you have any connection to those cars? Because they were. Oh God, I'm going to sound like a bigoted European here. They didn't handle great, right? They were big old boats, and they had big engines, and they were super comfortable, and in ways they did a different job. They were for highway driving, and you didn't have to go down narrow streets in Bologna. So there was a very different reason for you to design a car in America. What's your connection, if you have an emotional connection to those, post-war American cars?
Younger people don't have as much of a connection. And I think younger people also don't really realize how special that era was for the car in America. It's now taken for granted that America cars are an American thing, but the allure isn't there like it was then. But I mean, tail-fin Cadillacs and Chevy Bel Airs, there was an era where those were the coolest cars anybody could think of. There was no Mercedes-Benz that you wanted more. When they named it the Chevy Malibu, that was a car you actually wanted to drive in Malibu, which is laughable today. The Malibu is, a glorified rental car. But there was an era there, and it's hard for young people, I think, to really get that, including me to an extent. Even though I know the history, I can't imagine how it must have been. The car culture was such a big deal then, and they changed the model every year. And so you would know if your neighbor didn't have the newest one, and you would go out and get the newest one, and that was cool. And every year people would switch, and it was just the coolest thing in the world. And some of the cars that came out of that era were really special. But yes, in retrospect, they were terrible to drive, and some of them have not aged in a manner that people like me would be interested in now. Things change a little when you get into the 60s, even in the States. I mean, the 60s, the C2 Corvette in 63 was still one of the most beautiful cars ever. But yeah, the 50s stuff, it's kind of harder to own, harder to keep around, not really as appealing to people who are looking for more of a sports car, speed, fast thing. But at the time, it changed the perception of America globally, I think, too. America had these big, extravagant cars, Elvis with his Cadillacs, and that was a thing. Everybody knew about that.
Yeah, and that's sort of the 1950s rock and roll thing. Like people who are nostalgic about 1950s rock and roll, Elvis and Chuck Berry and Bill Haley, that's the car they sort of aspire. I'm not sure there are many of them alive anymore. But when I was growing up, you would get guys my age with greased back hair, and they wanted to have a caddy, and they probably have them for the weekend. Right. Because that was who they thought they were. The 60s were interesting because, and at that time as well, nobody was buying anyone else's cars. If you were French, you drove a French car. If you were British, you drove a British car, etc. The 60s change a little bit because we have, Swinging London, we have the Mini Cooper, we have the real onslaught of the British sports car, as awful as they were in hindsight. And we have Porsche. We have a lot. Porsche starts in 62, 63.
The 911.
So this is a really, really interesting time. Not just, you and I immediately pivot towards sports cars because they're the iconic, but across the board. The Mini was a people's car, but it was cute and it said something. It was the Beatles. It was Swinging London, It really now the designs are trying to speak to the culture that they live in, rather than trying to create the culture. Maybe.
Right.
Have you obviously the Corvettes of that era are stunning. Again, not the most reliable, but they did say something about who we were. Who if you were British, it said I'm a Mini.
Right.
If you're an American, I'm a Corvette. It was very easy to see yourself in the cars. And then it all went really wrong.
Right.
What the heck happened in the 90s? Right, 70s and 80s. There were exceptions, but there was a lot of very, very drab, very bland.
We're going to look back on the fuel crisis as being one of the pivotal moments in the entire history of the automobile. It definitely changed. It changed everything. No question. The 60s, like you said, and it wasn't the Corvette, the Mustang came out in the 60s, right? Like there were the original Camaro, there were so many amazing cars, the muscle cars, the Challengers and the Cudas. It was just a wild free-for-all of fun. And there weren't many regulations to conform to. And, unlike I think 50s and 40s cars where young people aren't really that into them and they're going to start dipping in value as the people who are into those cars start to die off. I think that's going to be a little different for the 60s cars because I got to be honest, even I, who only pretty much have had cars from the 80s and up, if a C2 Corvette got cheap enough or an E-Type, I'd be interested in getting one of those. Those are just cool and they will always be cool. But the 70s came and cars quickly needed to change and the automakers had never really been through a change. They had pretty much only been through expansion. And so they didn't really know how to change as quickly as they needed to, and they weren't capable. And America being what it is, in terms of competitiveness and capitalism, the Japanese cars came in relatively quickly in the late 70s and were easily able to make a big mark. And the Americans just had a very, very, very difficult time playing catch up, which personally I think lasted until probably only 10 or so years ago. I
was going to say until 2008 probably.
Yeah. Yes. It was probably around then when the bailout happened and the American automakers realized we need to get serious because they were able to continue doing okay making cars for their reliable constituency, which was kind of older people in the Midwest, people like that who were, they were going to buy American, they wanted something bigger. And of course, when the SUV started to become popular, the Americans were ready to capitalize on that, which helped. But they didn't start making really, truly great cars again like the 60s until, mid to late 2000s.
Remarkable, isn't it, that you had that enormously long period. And it was odd as well because we talk about, you've got a Ford GT behind you. When I saw it, first of all, I thought it was a Z8.
Right.
So there's definitely that retro piece, but it's 1960s retro. That does not look back to the 1970s. That looks back to the 1960s.
That's exactly right.
And all of the cars that do that retro thing, they created nostalgia in us for something we weren't there to experience, to be honest. You weren't around when the original Ford GT came out.
Right.
Nor was I. And ditto, the Z8. And I'm sure there are lots of other examples we can talk about. Even the Miata, which was a throwback to the 60s British sports cars. We still, whether we acknowledge it or not, we still have some nostalgia for that, even if we didn't live through it, right?
Right.
In terms of design.
That remains the era. And you just said that, and I hadn't really considered it, but it's so true. When that whole retro craze happened, 2001 to 2012, nobody was doing retro designs of 70s cars. That didn't happen. Even the Germans who did it, like the Z8 was the 507, modernized, and the Beetle, the new Beetle, they weren't going after 70s cars. That was they were picking out 50s and 60s. And of course, the Americans and the Thunderbird and all, and the Mustang and all that. But yeah, that was the time. To this day, Late 50s to very early 70s was the time in terms of car design. No question.
And it was interesting because I remember in about 1987, a pal of mine in London was going to buy, I think it was the W123 series E whatever it is, 280 Mercedes. Yeah. And I said, don't buy it. It just doesn't look good, man. Like at that point, they just changed the design.
Right.
And I'm like, it looks awful. He says, all cars look awful for a little while after the new one comes out. And then they become classic. And I was like, I'm not an expert, dude. That's never going to be a classic. You know?
Although, I wonder about that. I mean, there is becoming a movement of people who are into 80s and 90s cars.
Really?
Yeah, it's the Radwood movement. There's becoming more and more people my age or a little older are starting to become into that era of car. Now, 70s still doesn't have a big following. It's, in fact, the people who follow those cars and who are into them are generally doing it ironically. They know the car was crap, but they lived through it and it was kind of funny and like whatever. But there's now, at least in the 80s, they're now becoming a growing sentiment that there were no one considers them to be the most beautiful, but there were some weird and interesting cars that came out of that era. And there were some really special exotic cars that came out of that era. And so more and more, there's starting to become kind of a growing nostalgia from 80s and 90s and up cars.
The interesting thing I find about, like what you say, the early 70s through the 80s is as bad as the cars were, the music about cars, that was its peak. That we had the Beatles, Drive My Car, whatever, but we really started to sing about cars in the 70s and 80s, and God knows what we were singing about because they were ugly. But that was the golden era. If there was a reflection, if cars were reflected in another culture, and people painted cars, and BMW got those artistic cars and that. But in terms of it being cars being represented in the culture, it really was the 70s and 80s when people wrote, they wrote songs about cars.
Right. But by then everyone was mobile. I mean, there was no more, it's like the internet is now. Everyone had a car, everyone had multiple cars. So it was easier that was an era where everyone was, so maybe it was easier to resonate with people. Plus, there was the 80s to an extent were an era where people were singing about stuff that happened, like Springsteen, would sing about, I was playing baseball, that happened. Those were a lot of the music from that era generally.
And he wrote Pink Cadillac then as well, right? And he wrote Cadillac Ranch, and there's a lot of stuff out there. Yeah, let's talk about the jets. Let's talk, we covered it really quickly about the idea of the British sports cars maybe being there and maybe building a little bit on the idea that these heroes came back who had piloted. And BMW, of course, played on the fact that this was a propeller. They didn't want to shout too loud because it was a propeller they built for the Nazis. But, let's just park that over there for a second.
I wasn't going to go there, but all right.
No. But the really interesting one, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, it was Tony Scott's commercial. Tony, a brother of Cinemaphile, Ridley Scott's brother, yeah? And Tony Scott does that commercial for the Saab where the guy goes into his garage and the pilot goes into the hangar and they both come out. And actually he got the gig to make Top Gun from that. Did you know that?
No,
apparently,
I didn't know that.
Yeah. He got the gig to direct Top Gun because of that commercial. And I remember, and I was gullible enough that I actually bought a couple of Saabs, I swear, based on that commercial. But that to me was the real time when they really said, where this is your personal jet. It's both luxurious and fast, and they really sold us that idea. And I guess that's the end of the sort of the cars as jets and spaceships era. Well,
to an extent. I mean, I don't know. I think, in the what year was that commercial? Do you remember?
Probably 80. It was a 900. So I'm going to say 80. I would guess 83, 84. I think maybe 82.
There was that period where car design then took on. Do you remember all the 80s cars that had electronic gauge clusters and speedometers?
Right.
And
yes,
that?
Of course. Yeah,
that was a big period too. The Corvette. I mean, that was really hot, and I always assumed that was to try to make it seem a little bit aeronautical, aerospace, fighter. Because fighter jets at that time were really starting to become really like a cool thing. Top Gun was out. They were moving on to real jet propulsion. These things were fast and cool. So to an extent that existed, but also automakers still, to some extent, try to use those tie-ins. I mean, Saab was doing those Born from Jets commercials right up until the end. They kind of went back
to really?
it.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Back in like 2005, they restarted it. I think they thought about that commercial that you're talking about, and they thought, That was a good period. Maybe we can try to capitalize on some of that again. And then there was also a period, it's around the same time, you may remember when automakers started to tilt the cockpits a little bit towards the driver. This was a big BMW innovation about 83, 84, 85. So, because then it was like a true driver's car, had the interior turned away from the passenger. They still had enough, the passenger could see it. But the point, it was making a statement more than anything. Like Mercedes-Benz just has everything straight, not us. We're not like that. We turn everything. And that lasted for a long time. The Corvette that came out in 84 did that same basic thing and kind of kept that going through the 90s and even still today.
Do you think, are we now smart enough to not be sold that kind of BS? That kind of image making around what is basically a consumer product, or are they still doing it to us?
Yeah, we're not smart enough to. Come on, everybody who's buying an SUV today, and a lot of people are honest with themselves about it, but everybody who's buying an SUV today knows they could have the exact same car in a hatchback. But especially now, there's become this big off-roader thing. That's become the big trend in the last few years. Jeeps are really popular, and the Ford Raptor and all that. And no, I think people want to feel like they're going to go off-road. And the automakers really play it up. You see a lot of RAV4 commercials where people are driving through the desert and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Half my neighborhood has a RAV4. Nobody's driving through any deserts. I know these people. Not happening.
Right. And the people who drive trucks, and they're not plumbers or electricians. Nothing's going in the car. Maybe the groceries from Whole Foods are going in the bed of that pickup truck. But it says, rugged individual.
Right.
It says it's making another statement.
Right. And trucks have kind of always been that way. But now that's another thing. It's another good example. Trucks are now becoming more and more usable. Like in the past, it was a work vehicle in the 80s and 90s. That a leather seats in a truck in the 90s was a big step. Now, DVD players, sunroofs, cooled seats, adaptive cruise control, and so you're now able to drive a truck and have it be a family vehicle, and then you can have that persona that you want. I got a truck because I'm whatever you're trying to say. No, I think we're the exact same people that we were back then. We just still want to show what we think we are, and we're willing to take what the manufacturer feeds us. Nobody is, the new Corvette, Ferraris, nobody's going to drive those cars anywhere near their limit. Ever, at any point, at any time. You got to be on a racetrack, but it's pretty cool. You got a Ferrari, you're cool. You got a new Corvette, you're cool. You're living that dream. And people see it at a stoplight, and that means more than the performance ever will.
Let's talk about, because there was a certain amount of cross-pollinization between countries, but to me, the sort of the mecca of the design is Italy, right? And I always think the Italians are the people who know how to live best, right? They have food,
totally.
they have art, they make Ferraris, they make Maseratis, they make all these things basically in one town.
Right.
They have an incredible music, they have an incredible fine art history. The food, the geography, everything, right? To me, they're the people who know how to live. Is that what it is that makes their designs so attractive to us all? Because it's not just like I want to be Italian. It's like there's something visceral in Italian design that seems to speak to us on a very sort of almost lizard brain level.
First off, I completely agree. It is unusual when another country's automaker designs a car as beautiful as an Italian car. But it is unusual when an Italian car is designed poorly, right? That's the thing. Like the Z8, we all agree is one of the most beautiful cars. Well, the Germans, that's incredible that the Germans pulled that off. But then when the Italians make one bad car, it's like, I can't believe that happened, It is generally expected that all Italian cars are beautiful. Yeah, I've always felt the same way. Italy is, to me, the place. And my heritage is Italian, and I generally find that Americans who have heritage in certain countries tend to prefer that country. So maybe I'm biased, but you go there and it's the people are beautiful, the places are beautiful, they just hang out a lot, the country is gorgeous, they only know beauty and style, Milan is the fashion center. And I think that the Italians, to some extent, almost feel that they have a responsibility. The Germans were off creating cars in the German way. They were built properly. But the Italians were like, we don't need to think about that crap. We're just going to build it the most beautifully. And that tradition is generally continued to this day.
And it is sort of odd that you look at. I mean, I would say obviously I'm biased about this. I think the Citroen DS is beautiful. I can't think of many other beautiful French cars.
Exactly.
But the French seem to just abandon their sense of je ne sais quoi and style and all that when they came to building cars. They sort of went, yeah. It wasn't their thing. Like, we'll do everything else brilliantly. We'll cook brilliantly. We'll do fashion. We'll do, farmer strikes. We'll be the best in the world. A lot of other things. But the cars, we leave that to the Italians. And then you look at other countries who, like Spain, never a car made in anger, right? Which is really strange, right?
Right.
Because, what's the difference? They're both peninsular countries.
Right.
They both have these great amazing artistic traditions. Not a car out of Spain.
Right.
In fairness to the Brits, when they were making theirs, their cars did kind of reflect the demise of empire. Their cars were, they were okay, but not as good as some of the people in the New World, or they weren't, and the 3-day week, and then the build quality, and the whole country's falling apart, and the cars represent that. Is there anything in the East that you think, what do you think about how the Japanese sense of design evolved? Because it was copycat to begin with. Do you think there's now a Japanese, and let's just stay with Japan, we can maybe talk about Korea as well, but let's stay with Japan. Do you think that there is now a Japanese style vernacular that is as powerful as, even as powerful as the American?
I don't get it. I've never understood why there isn't. No, to answer your question, no. I still to this day feel that when I look at a Japanese car, I feel that it is built for practical purpose. The funny thing about that is some of them aren't. The Lexus LC and the LFA are both beautiful, special cars. And I could probably name others, the Honda S2000 if you really think about it, but it's still...
Well, the Honda, the one they just made again, the one from the 80s, sorry, it looked like a Ferrari. My brain is blanking here. Oh, the NSX.
Yeah.
Great, very good sports car. Proper driver's car.
But its design is derivative. And I can't quite put my finger. I've never been able to do this, and I think it's one of my great failings as a journalist. Although, frankly, I feel other people have the same problem. It's hard to describe why the Japanese have never been able to crack that barrier into desirable. But they just never have. You see a Japanese car and you think, I want that to carry my kids around, or I want that. So they make beautiful luxury. Lexus has some fantastic luxury cars. They're great in that sense. Reliable, of course. But you never quite have the same feeling of desire that you do for various other, for European brands and that kind of thing. It just, and to an extent, even a lot of American cars. The Japanese have never built Ford GT. They've never been able to create cars quite like that, even if given big money. The Lexus LFA was intended to be a crazy halo car, but when you look at it, it just doesn't quite, you would never look at that and think, oh, I want that instead of a Ford GT or an F40. It just doesn't quite have the, maybe
it doesn't stir the passion.
Right, for sure. And the Korean, frankly, is the same way to me. They just have never quite gotten to that point.
And then while we're on the topic, because of course, the 80s were really the Japanese decade. That's when we all started eating sushi, and we started to get a manga and all of the Japanese influences that happened in the West. And as you say, the car thing, they didn't seem to embody all of the great culture they had into the vehicles they built. As I look at China, I don't know, and I don't know if we can agree on this, but we probably are already living in the Chinese century. That they are now so socially and global politically powerful that we need to get used to the idea that these guys are going to be running the joint probably for
I will never forget the day I worked at Porsche Cars North America, and I will never forget the day the Chinese overtook in sales the Americans, because America was always the most important market, and that was it for me. That was years ago. And
the Chinese design is kind of interesting though. It feels more original than maybe what was happening in Japan when they were at the same point in their evolution. I'm not going to say I like it, but maybe I'm looking at it with the wrong eyes. Maybe to a Chinese person, the Chinese design cars are beautiful. I don't know. Do you think we'll get to a point? We don't. They're not building anything we want to buy yet, correct?
No, yeah, for sure,
Right,
correct.
right.
But they will. I mean,
They will.
it would be insane. You know, the American automakers in the 70s and 80s, they were like Japan, Korea in the 90s, but that's nothing. Well, now they got market share. You know, we
Right,
can't
and
discount them.
yeah, it was interesting as well because I remember there was a time when, you know, a Samsung television was a piece of was a
Right,
son of a
yeah,
line,
exactly.
You know, you bought Sony or you bought Grundig if you wanted German stuff, and now they're amazing. And the same thing with LG, I think, which is
Right.
Korean. So all of that took over. What the Chinese have done and what they may have an advantage in is in electric cars, because a lot of the technology, at least the industrialization of the technology, is happening there. And they've already got one sports car, which is sort of Tesla-ish, but it's more expensive and not as good. Let me ask you about Tesla, by the way, because we talked about this whole thing of identifying who you were. And I want to talk a little bit about politics here.
Okay.
I remember
Rare
Mario
topic.
Mario Puzo's books before The Godfather. One of them was called Fools Die. And it describes a writer going into Beverly Hills. And somebody said to him, they'll all know you're a writer from New York because you'll be the only person there with a domestic car. Right? And that was the mark of both wealth and liberalism, that you drove a Mercedes, you drove a BMW. And probably at the same time, if you voted Republican, you were probably driving a Cadillac, right? You were probably driving American. Where do you think Tesla lies in the sort of socio-political mind of Americans? It does everything, right? It's made in America, it's fast, it's roomy, it's environmentally friendly, it ticks the boxes for everybody. It's expensive, but it ticks the boxes.
It has absolutely astonished me, the cross-section that they have managed to achieve with those cars. Because you no longer have a Buy American thing. I'm not going to try that new thing because it's not American. Well, it is American. In fact, it's built in America, which some American cars aren't. Truthfully, to answer your question, I know people on extremes of this political spectrum, and one of the few things they can agree on is Tesla. Everybody who's into stuff likes the technology. Everybody's into tech likes how new it is. The design is debatable, but you know, this is what you have, and people, that's what you get. And so the built in America thing factors in, I think, for a lot of people who want the car. The innovation, the self-driving, the superchargers, and they've created a whole culture around Tesla. You know, you knowing all these things, how it works. You tell your friends about it. Everybody gets in and they're very excited. And I think that car has been able to transcend. And this is also true of a lot of just mainstream cars, Camrys and, you know, Hondas, whatever. But that car, maybe more than any other expensive car, has been able to, or special car, has been able to transcend any identification of the people who are driving it. You cannot assume anything about a Tesla owner.
The only thing I will assume, and I'm going to go out on a limb here, is I have driven Teslas, and I find them soulless.
Do you feel that way about all electric cars?
No, I don't think it's that I'm a gearhead, a petrol head. I don't think it's that. I felt like it was the evolution of all of these these parts of the driving of it that were taken away from me in some way. That it was really a computer that went really fast. And maybe I'm just an old geezer and I like my smelly, loud cars. I don't know. It doesn't do anything wrong. I mean, it handles well. It's very fast. You can put your groceries in it. It's very comfortable. It's tech. It's safe. What do you feel about them?
To an extent, I agree. However, I would also argue that the majority of new cars feel relatively soulless. And I would also argue that that's not necessarily a bad thing. You know, I lived in Philly, driving in Southern California. You got a lot of traffic. I kind of just want to sit in a computer on wheels most of the time. When I'm sitting in bumper to bumper, I don't care if the car has soul. I just want to be honest, what I want to do is email from my car. That's my grand dream. Now, it's a different story when you go to take a car out on a weekend. And I know a lot of people with Teslas, and I go on drives with them, and their Tesla never happens to show up when we go do canyon drives. That doesn't occur. I think as long as cars still exist that have a soul, I'm okay with the fact that cars evolved to the point of being computers on wheels for daily driver, regular, around-town cars. Doesn't bother me, believe it or not. And that's an unusual thing for a car enthusiast to admit, but I'm realistic about my use case for cars. When I want to have fun, I can take this out and go have a good time, and it's a blast, and I will never give that up. But, I wish my car drove itself more than it does, to be honest.
Quickly, and you've given us a lot of your time, and I'm very, very, very appreciative. I mean, just the other thing I want to just very quickly cover is, we've been told that the electric car is the future, and but the environmental damage that the creation of batteries and the creation of solar panels and all that, we don't know what that's going to be.
Right.
Have you all? I mean, most people seem to have decided that the future's electric kind of thing. Is that how you see it evolving?
I wonder about that. I don't know. I think that in the near term, the answer is probably yes. I think there could be a mixture of electric and plug-in hybrid electric with gasoline and hydrogen. There are a lot of good arguments for hydrogen. There are some bad ones, but there are some bad ones for battery too.
Right.
I don't see a good reason why I don't think we as a people are really able to determine yet precisely what will emerge as the leader of the future. Electric cars still make up an enormously small portion of the market, and they're more expensive than traditional cars unless you put massive tax incentives on them, which can't last forever. And a lot of people, many humans, don't have the ability to charge an electric car on a frequent basis. And no one on a road trip really wants to stop every 3 hours for 20, 30 minutes. It's not realistic. There are some drawbacks, and of course the environmental one that you named. I don't know. I really, really don't know. I'm interested to see how it plays out, and I'm open to anything. I kind of think hydrogen cars are cool and interesting,
right.
But we'll find out. The market will obviously decide.
Thank you so much. This has been a joy.